Good afternoon. I'm Ethan Bueno de Mesquita. I'm a professor at the Harris School and one of the deputy deans. So welcome to the afternoon academic symposium. Obviously, sort of the work of the Pearson Institute is going to be to take some of the really critical questions about global conflicts and ask some of the best minds in the world to think hard about them, to train students, and to help inform policymakers about those. And so we wanted this afternoon to take the opportunity to give you a little taste of that kind of work and what's ahead for us. And so we've invited 3 distinguished scholars who've done important work trying to understand conflict and its causes and its solutions, to tell you about their work, and then to have a discussion and take questions. So our first speaker is Melissa Dell. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Economics at Harvard and a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Her work is on long-run economic development and as it interacts with conflict. She's done important work, especially in Latin America and on the Mexican drug war, and we're fortunate to have her with us. So it's all yours.
Great. Thank you very much to the Harris School for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here and to have the chance to talk about estimating causal effects of security interventions, in particular with applications to the Mexican drug war. So if we think about economics or policy making more generally, often the gold standard of evidence that we want to have is some sort of randomized controlled trial where we can actually randomize different policy approaches and measure which one works best. And that's great when it's feasible. You can have very compelling evidence on which to base policy decisions. But for many of the questions that we're interested in today, understanding the causes of major conflicts, how they can be resolved, what their economic effects are, it's often infeasible to have a randomized intervention, or even if we could have one, it wouldn't necessarily even be ethical. The good news is that there's still oftentimes features of major policies, major events that allow us to make very rigorous conclusions and to separate out causal effects, even where we're not able to look randomly at which sort of policies would work best. So let's say, for example, that we want to understand the long-run impacts that an insurgency would have on the countryside in a particular country. You know, of course, places that have insurgency might be generally different, poorer, et cetera, than places that don't, so it makes it very difficult to estimate those effects. But one thing that we could do, for example, is to say, well, we know that people are more likely to join an insurgent group when there's a drought or some other sort of economic shock that we didn't ourselves cause, that's sort of randomly assigned on that particular village, and we can use that variation to say, okay, we have 2 places that look very similar before, what happens after the insurgency? Or similarly, we could exploit the fact that many policies are discontinuous. So take, for example, during the Vietnam War, one of the ways that the US decided where to send its troops, where to bomb, was to give villages a numerical security score based on underlying data. So you might have one village that's a 4.499 and another village that's a 4.501. The one that's a 4.499 gets rounded down to a 4 and is called a somewhat secure village. The one that's a 4.501 gets rounded up to a 5 and receives a different set of treatments. And we can use that sort of variation to say, okay, we have these 2 places that look really similar before, and because the policy changes discontinuously at a certain threshold, we can say, okay, what are the causal effects of that policy in the long run? So there's lots of examples like this, and I've put up a citation of a great literature review for those of you who are interested, but I'm going to focus in particular today on one specific example, which in the context of the war on drugs. So drug-related violence in Mexico has claimed over 100,000 lives since 2007. If you look at various points during the past 10 years, the most violent places in Mexico have had more violent deaths than the most violent places in Iraq or Afghanistan at the same time. So this is clearly a huge problem, and it coincides very much with a major crackdown on the drug trade that was started in Mexico in 2006. And yet we have relatively little causal evidence on whether crackdowns on the drug trade affect violence and whether they affect drug trafficking. And so what I'm doing in this study is to say, how do crackdowns on drug trafficking organizations in Mexico affect violence and drug trafficking routes, both in the municipalities that receive those crackdowns and in municipalities along alternative drug trafficking routes. And now the really big challenge of being able to answer this question is that the Mexican government is not going to say, okay, I'm going to draw a number out of a hat and decide randomly where we're going to send the military to crack down on the drug trade. It doesn't work that way. And it may well be that they decide to crack down in the places where they expect violence is going to increase in any case. So myself as the researcher, if I just compare places where they crack down to places where they don't, maybe no surprise, I find that the places where they crack down are violent, but maybe they would have been violent in any case. And so we can't really draw policy conclusions from that. And so what I do in order to make progress on this question is to look at a specific set of municipalities that got a crackdown more or less randomly because of the nature of politics. So the crackdown in Mexico has been largely coordinated by a single political party called the PAN that was in office in Mexico between 2006 and 2012, and the centerpiece of their policy was cracking down on the drug trade. And mayors in municipalities were an important part of that policy. And so what I do in order to get a good control group to measure the impacts of crackdowns is I compare municipalities that have a close election involving the PAN party, which is the party that has spearheaded the crackdown on the drug trade. So sure, in municipalities where the PAN wins by a very wide margin, those are going to look a lot different than municipalities where the PAN loses by a wide margin. You know, just this would be the case if you looked at the Republican vote margin in the US. However, when I narrow in my focus on the set of municipalities that have very close elections, so the PAN candidate just barely wins by 1% of the vote or just barely loses, those municipalities look very similar before the election. So I have effectively a good control group that I can use to say, okay, what's the impact of having a PAN mayor? And since PAN mayors are likely to crack down, I can use that to think about the impacts of having a crackdown. And then a second really key part of the study is that if we're thinking about organized crime, you can't just consider what happens in the places where you crack down, because of course drug traffickers, if you crack down on them, they're not just going to give up their life of crime and sell ice cream instead. They're probably going to take their criminal enterprise and move it somewhere more lucrative to criminal activity. So if you want to fully understand the impacts of the policy, you have to think about spillovers as well. And I'm going to do that by modeling drug trafficking routes. So specifically, I'm going to ask 3 questions. What are the impacts of crackdowns on violence? What are the economic mechanisms that drive those impacts? And do crackdowns in one place affect drug trafficking and violence elsewhere? And a brief preview of my results is as follows. So I find that when a PAN mayor barely wins an election, you see a large increase in drug violence. And some of that increase comes from police fighting against traffickers. But the vast majority of the violence is drug traffickers killing each other. So why is it that when the military, the police come in and crack down in a municipality, why do all of a sudden drug gangs start fighting each other? And so to think about this, I look at different types of municipalities. So let's say that you have a municipality controlled by a drug gang who controls the entire state. In those cases, when there's a crackdown, you see a little bit of an increase in violence, but not so much. However, if you see a municipality in an area that's disputed between different drug gangs, and then the military, the police come in and crack down, you see a huge spike in drug violence. And that increase in drug violence is sustained for as long as we have data available, so for about 6 years. Why does this happen? Well, let's say that I'm a drug trafficker, and the police come in and crack down on me. That's going to weaken me. And let's say I have a rival, Jake is my rival. Now I'm weakened. It may not be a great time to control my territory because the police are there cracking down, but they're not going to be there forever. Eventually they're going to move on to somewhere else and the crackdown's going to stop. It's a great time for Jake to try to come and attack me while I'm weak so he can take control of my territory and make money from controlling it later after the crackdown's over. But that tends to lead to sustained increases in violence. Okay, the second set of results is that when you crack down in one place, I see drug confiscations increase along alternative drug trafficking routes, and moreover, I see violence increase along those routes. So basically what the drug traffickers are doing is when there's a crackdown in one place, they'll go around. And we see violence increase along their alternative routes, especially in cases where other drug traffickers are already using those routes. Okay, so before I give you a little bit more detail about the results, I'm going to provide some key facts about the Mexican drug trade that are important to know. So the biggest thing is that Mexican drug traffickers make a lot of money selling drugs in the US, on the order of magnitude of around $25 billion a year. Compared to that, they make relatively little money selling drugs in Mexico, so it's really all about transporting these drugs to the US. And as a result, drug trafficking organizations control a large number of municipalities in Mexico. They buy off politicians. They have people working for them in those municipalities, and they're bringing large quantities of drugs, essentially, into the US. So if you look historically, Mexico is controlled by a single political party called the PRI, and that party tended to take a fairly passive stance towards the illicit drug trade. They were sort of happy to turn a blind eye to it. Whereas the crackdown on the drug trade has been spearheaded by the PAN political party, and in particular by President Felipe Calderón, who was in office in Mexico between 2006 and 2012. Now, because drug traffickers are heavily armed, it's mostly the military and the federal police that are going in and fighting them, but mayors are enormously important because they have information. They have a lot of knowledge about what's going on in their municipality, and the military needs that knowledge to know where the drug traffickers are at and how to target them. And as a result, mayors are going to be very important. They have the career incentives to help the president and their party, and there's a lot of evidence that PAN mayors coordinated well with the PAN federal government to combat drug trafficking. Okay, so as I mentioned in the introduction, really the big challenge of looking at this question is to find a good control group, to find a group that would have had, the same violence as the places that got a crackdown, if they'd gotten a crackdown as well. And so in order to do that, I focused on these close elections involving the PAN party. And when we look at these municipalities before the elections, they look similar along every dimension that we can observe. So we can look at economic characteristics, political characteristics, geographic characteristics, characteristics of their road network, demographic characteristics, a variety of things, and they look similar in every respect. So what this is telling us is this is a good control group. Any changes that we see between places where the PAN barely won and they barely lost, we can safely attribute that to the PAN being in power and plausibly to them cracking down on the drug trade. So this figure shows my main results. So on the horizontal axis, you have time measured in quarters. And on the vertical axis, you have the differences in the homicide rate between places that barely elect a PAN mayor and places where the PAN mayor barely loses. And the black is showing you what happens for about 15 years before the election takes place. And you can see that things look very, very similar. These municipalities are not different to start out with. However, after the election, you see in the green that violence spikes upward in the places that barely elect the PAN. And again, you see the same thing if you're looking, say, at police-criminal confrontations, but most of this violence is between drug traffickers. The orange is the next election cycle, and the purple is when the next mayor takes office. Regardless of what party he's in, violence stays up, because once you destabilize the equilibrium and you start these conflicts between gangs, they take a long time to resolve. Okay. I also look at heterogeneity. So what are the places that are experiencing these effects? The effects on homicides tend to be the largest in places that are already violent, that already have gang conflicts to start with. They tend to be the largest in places that are close to the US, which makes a lot of sense given that that's where the drug markets are. They tend to be the largest in places that didn't have a PAN mayor before. And as I said earlier, they tend to be the largest in places where the control of territory is disputed. On the other hand, we don't see effects of PAN mayors on places where there's not a drug trafficking organization, or we don't see effect on PAN mayors before the federal government has this strategy of cracking down on the drug trade, because if you're just a mayor by yourself, there's not a lot you can do. Really, where your leverage comes is by giving the federal government information that they use to crack down. Okay, so I want to move on to talking about how I predict spillovers. How do these crackdowns affect other municipalities? Because if we just looked at this part of the picture, we wouldn't be getting the whole picture. And so what I do, in order to get a sense of where I think drug trafficking activity is likely to be diverted, is I predict the drug trafficking routes the drug traffickers take from the drug-producing municipalities in Mexico, so places that are growing heroin, that are making meth, that are growing marijuana, and US points of entry. And so I start out really simple, and I just assume that drug traffickers take the shortest route. So imagine them there with their GPSs in the drug-producing municipality. They put in the nearest US point of entry, and if there's been a crackdown in a municipality because the pawn mayor got elected, they go around that municipality. So let me demonstrate this with some pictures. So in this picture, A is a drug-producing municipality in Mexico. B is a US point of entry. You see the road network in yellow and some Mexican municipalities in the background. The darker the color of the municipality, the more illicit drug confiscations are in that municipality, and the drug trafficker is going to take the shortest route in blue between point A and point B. Now let's say that there's a crackdown in that municipality in the middle. As a result, the drug traffickers don't want to go through there any longer because their drugs are more likely to get confiscated. And so they're going to go around. They're going to take the next shortest route that avoids that crackdown. And if we think that drug confiscation rates are relatively constant over time, which is reasonable because these elections are taking place at different times in different municipalities, then if my model's correct, we should see seizures of illicit drugs increase along the alternative routes. And in fact, that's what we see in the actual data when I look at all drug-producing municipalities in Mexico. I look at all the close elections that happen over a period of time between 2006 and 2010. If a municipality acquires a predicted drug trafficking route because of a crackdown that happens somewhere else, we see illicit drug confiscations go up, which suggests my model's reasonable. And we see that happen not just in the places that border where there's a crackdown, but also in places that are further away. In this exercise, what I did was to randomly reassign crackdowns to different municipalities in Mexico following the same time pattern as actual crackdowns. And my estimate is way out in the right tail of the distribution. So what this tells us is what I'm finding is very, very unlikely to arise sheerly by chance. And then finally, if we look within a municipality that gets a predicted drug trafficking route because of a crackdown that happens somewhere else, we see that violence as well, drug trade-related homicides, increase in that municipality, whether or not it's whether they have one or what the drug trade-related homicide rate is. And this happens in particular when drug trade is diverted to an alternative route that other drug traffickers are already using. Okay, so clearly my model's pretty simple. You might be sitting here saying, well, why are drug traffickers so dumb? Don't they take a more complicated route? So I add some additional richness to the model in the paper. So for example, I have a game theoretic model where I assume that drug traffickers don't like it when they run into other drug traffickers. And they particularly don't like it at the US border because it's harder to shove drugs through if you're trying to push more drugs through those bottlenecks. So you can do that. You can estimate how much it costs to pass through your own drug trafficking organization's territory versus another territory. Or you can actually estimate how much it costs to have a pawn mayor in office and then impose that everywhere. And so these things improve the predictive power of the model, but they don't fundamentally change the results. Overall, drug traffickers are taking pretty direct routes to the US, and when there's a crackdown, they go around. Okay, so in conclusion, I've shown you that crackdowns on the drug trade in Mexico have increased violence, both in the municipalities that experience those crackdowns and along alternative routes. And I've also shown you that we're able to predict pretty well the routes that drug traffickers take. So I think that there's several things that we can draw from this. So clearly the challenges that Mexico's facing are very difficult. Drug traffickers are making $20 billion a year selling drugs in the US. They use some of that money to go back home and to corrupt public officials. I've seen the accounting books of the Zetas, one of the major drug trafficking organizations, and they actually spend more on bribes than they spend on wages. So they're spending a lot of money to corrupt the system. That makes it even harder for the system to deal with these increases in violence that happen following crackdowns. So clearly it's a really major problem, and we can disagree, and there needs to be more research on exactly what's the best way to deal with it. But I think that what we get from this paper is, first of all, we understand better how traffickers' economic objectives and the constraints imposed by the road network in Mexico affect the pattern of violence. This knowledge could potentially be used to say if you're the authorities and you want to predict what routes drug traffickers are going to take after you crack down. Beyond that, I think we see very concretely some of the reasons why the war on drugs has proved so difficult to fight. Thank you.
There's going to be an opportunity to ask questions of our speakers, but I think we're going to hear all three of their remarks, give them an opportunity to talk amongst themselves in front of us a bit and see if they have questions for each other. And then we will have plenty of time for questions. So you should, if you have a question, about the Mexican drug war, you should note it to yourself and not forget. So our next speaker is Ruben Enikolopov, who's an ICREA research professor at the Barcelona Institute of Political Economy and Governance, an adjunct professor at the Universitat Pompeu Fabra, an affiliate professor at the Barcelona Graduate School of Economics, and an associate professor at the New Economics School in Moscow. Europeans have a lot of affiliations. He's previously served as a consultant to the World Bank and the UN. He's an expert in the political economy of development, the economics of mass media, and of late has been doing a lot of important work doing impact evaluations and randomized trials for development programs in Afghanistan. So it's all yours, Ruben.
So first of all, thanks a lot for the opportunity to present here at the start of such a great initiative by Pearson's family. And the work that I wanted to talk about is the work that I've done with my colleagues Andrew Beath from World Bank and Fatini Christie from MIT, which is trying to understand whether this approach recently, which was mentioned all the time in public news on winning hearts and minds, actually works in Afghanistan. So basically the idea behind this approach is that one of the key problems that leads to insurgency and problems in countries such as Afghanistan, for example, is a lack of economic development. So if we bring development aid, that can be used as in some sense, not only to improve the economic lives of the people, but serve as a counterinsurgency tool by reducing the incentives of the people to join insurgency, and thus that should lead to a decrease in violence. The problem with this approach is that it sounds good in theory. There's almost no good evidence on how well this approach works in practice. Because there actually, if you start thinking deep about this, there are a lot of limitations to this approach in consideration why this may not work in reality. And actually, the empirical research that we have so far on the effect of aid produces conflicting results. So there are some works by Nathan and Nancy Chan, for example, showing that the food aid that is sent to countries, developing countries, actually leads to increase in conflict. For example, because the insurgency groups can capture this aid, sell it, and finance their operations. Even if we look at more targeted aid, like localized programs that we know that they're delivered to the place, there are, again, different results depending on the context. So the work of Jake in Iraq shows that these small-scale programs by US military actually does improve security situation, so it looks like this approach is working. But there are conflicting evidence from Philippines, for example, in the work that Joe has done, that it leads to completely the opposite predictions, that the aid actually increases conflict, for example, because insurgency groups, they know that the aid is coming, and they attack the villages that are supposed to receive the aid to prevent them from getting this aid. So there's conflicting evidence on that. And there are many other empirical works, so these ones are like the best ones, but there are a lot of other empirical works that address this issue, and these works usually have this methodological problem of trying to assess the effect of aid that is caused by this non-random assignment of aid. So basically, if you just look at the places that received aid and compare them with places that did not receive aid, and you compare the security situation with in these places, you don't learn much, because aid is not randomly dropped. So you can be targeting, for example, and then depending on the program, you can try to target, for example, the most problematic cases because they are in most need of the help. And then if you just compare them, it looks like the places that are getting aid have worse security situation. Or the other way around, you want to save your personnel, so you send aid to places that are safe, and you see that the places that get aid look better on security grounds. So this is the empirical problem that faces these studies, and what we do in this paper, we use what Melissa called the gold standard. We use the randomized field experiment, in which basically we randomly assign aid. So we have like, I'll mention how we do it, but there's basically some villages that some of them will receive aid, some will not, or they will receive it later. But which villages do receive, which are not, is decided completely randomly, like our computer draw this. And this makes this perfect comparison of this for the purposes that we are interested in, because like just looking at the villages that got aid and didn't get aid, you know that they're absolutely the same, except for the fact that some of them got lucky in our computer, some didn't. And by comparing them, you really see the effect of the causal effect of the program. So we'll look at the effect of this program on, first of all, the most important, on security situation. Does really aid decrease violence? But to also try to understand the mechanism behind this. So first, we are interested in also whether it's sustained effects. So we'll look at during the implementation phase and after the finish of the program, several years after the start of the program. And we're also interested in understanding mechanisms, whether it's actually what is behind the idea of winning hearts and minds, whether it's actually changes the attitudes towards government. And that is the reason why this works, or there's some other mechanism. So basically, we'll be testing this logic of the approach of winning hearts and minds, which basically the logic is that you give aid to local people, it improves their economic well-being, that improves their attitudes towards government, they're less likely to join insurgency, and that leads to a reduction in violence. So we'll try to provide evidence whether this is indeed the case and whether this logic works. And the context in which we'll be doing this, we'll be looking at the effect of the National Solidarity Program in Afghanistan, which is by far like the biggest development program in Afghanistan, which aims to cover basically all villages in Afghanistan. So far, covered more than 30,000 of villages already, and it's a huge program that involves a lot of parties, in which basically the funding comes from international donors. It's managed by the Afghan Ministry of Afghan government, and on the ground it's implemented by NGOs, both international and local NGOs. And this is a huge program that involves not only actually giving money, but actually changing the governance structure at the local level in Afghan villages, because basically what happens is they come to villages, they organize democratic elections of the village councils. Then these village councils, in consultation with villagers, actually decide on which projects they want to spend the money. So they're giving a certain amount of money, but they themselves decide which projects they want to spend it, whether it be drinking water, roads, etc. Then these projects are implemented, and we'll see the effect of this. And by Afghan standards, this is a huge program in terms of money, because it's $200 per household. So if you can calculate it, basically it's like half of a yearly GDP per capita that is given to them. So it's a very important program for that. And this is the example of what you can do in this program. So this is the drinking water well that was built by this program. And as you've noticed by this sign there, it clearly wants to make sure that people understand that this drinking well was built by the government program. So it's not only bringing development aid, it's also signaling that the central government cares, and this is money from central government, which supposedly has to improve attitudes towards central government in Kabul. So basically what we do, we have 500 villages which that were supposed to receive aid this program either now or in the next round, which will be in 4 years. So we randomly divide them into 150 villages that get it now and 250 that will get it 4 years later down the road. To start with, then we come and we collect data, and we collected the data in 2007 on the baseline characteristics, like how what was going on in these villages before the start of the program. Then we wait until they elect these councils. Then they select the projects. They start implementing the projects. Then we come back and we conduct the first survey, and we look at what's going on during the implementation of the program, but 2 years after the start of the program. Then we wait until all the projects are finished, and we come back 2 years more later and conduct the last survey to understand what's going on after the end of the program. And this will be the survey data that we'll be using in our analysis. And basically the villages in which we will be we were working were really spread out across Afghanistan, so we wanted to get as representative picture as possible, given the constraint that we could not go to the southern provinces because it's basically too dangerous to go there, and the actual program doesn't really make it there, NSP, and also, as researchers, we have some ethical concern of sending people to such dangerous places. So we were like just excluding the most dangerous part. We were working in the rest of Afghanistan, and most importantly, we were working in an area that was in our one of the most dangerous in our sample of this province of Nangarhar that is bordering Pakistan. And as you will see in the results, it is a very special area that is different from others in terms of the results that we get. But apart from that, it was a pretty representative sample of 500 different villages in Afghanistan, and you see that the red and green dots are the villages that ended up in what's called treatment group, that they received aid in 2007, and the red dots are the villages that received it 4 years down the road, and we'll be comparing them to understand the difference in the effects. So then we collected the data on the outcomes in these villages, and the main source of data is the data from basically it's from international security forces in Afghanistan that track all the security incidents that happened in Afghanistan. So we know all the security incidents, where they happened exactly, the geographical location, and when they happened. So basically we'll be looking at different vicinities of the villages, of how many security incidents happened, varying the radius from 1 kilometer to 15 kilometers, and combining all this information to get like at the measure of how many security incidents near each village are happening. Basically, what we'll be doing is comparing the number of incidents with close to the villages that got the program compared to the number of incidents near the villages that did not get the program. And on top of that, so this will be the kind of piece of objective data that we'll be using, the actual security incidents, but we're also interested in economic outcomes, attitudes of the villagers, etc. So for that, we'll be using this data on these 3 waves of surveys that we conducted, and in each wave, we had like approximately like 15,000 villagers surveyed across Afghanistan. And as I said, we'll be we are interested also in like the dynamic effects, how these effects evolve over time. So we'll be basically looking at 3 periods, in which the first is before the start of the program, which is needed just to check that nothing happened. Before the start of the program, these villages were absolutely identical, and this is the case. They're identical. Then we look at the midline period, which is the first, like after 2 years after the start of the program, while the projects are still being implemented, and end line will be like 4 years after the start of the project, when all the projects were finished. And this is how we collected data, with talking with people and collecting a lot of data on their attitudes, security, perception of security, etc. And these are the results that we get are presented in this table, but basically what they mean is that if we just compare the villages that got the program and not, we do see that there are slightly less security incidents on average near the villages that got the program. But the difference is like approximately 3%. It's so small that it's basically statistically insignificant. So we cannot be sure that the effect is there. But what is important is that there's a huge heterogeneity of results. So if we look separately at this province that borders Pakistan, there's absolutely nothing going on there. There's no positive effect of the program. If you look close enough, it looks like there's increase in violence in this area. Whereas in all other areas, the non-bordering Pakistan, there's a significant and a noticeable effect that leads to decrease in violence. And we can show that this is really, it looks like this is really related to the distance from Pakistan. If you look at other characteristics of these provinces, the previous production of opium, the ethnic composition, the previous violence, there's no difference in the effects. The only thing that makes a difference is whether you're close to Pakistan or not. And this is like basically the main finding that we observe, but basically the same results on security you can get if you ask people of their perceptions of security. So the previous results were an actual number of security incidents. If you ask people whether they feel safe traveling on the roads, living in their village, their results are exactly the same. They feel much safer in all areas that are not bordering Pakistan as a result of the program. If you live in this province near Pakistan, there's no effect of aid on your perception of security. And then we try to understand the mechanism, why this happens, and where the chain of logic breaks down. And we see that actually the improvements in economic welfare, they are very strong, and they're present in all provinces. Even in provinces that are bordering Pakistan, this development program does lead to a significant improvement in economic conditions of the people, which is it's already an important finding that this development program actually helps people on the ground, because it's also, you cannot take it for granted, and some people actually doubt this, that development programs help. They do, in this particular context, all over in all provinces. The point in which actually it does break down is attitudes towards government. So in provinces in which in the province that borders Pakistan, we see that despite an improvement in economic outcomes, you do not observe an improvement in attitudes towards government. But in all other provinces, you do see that villagers feel much better to all, and we ask a whole range of questions, all branches of government, and you see it all over the board. They do feel much better towards the government. Their attitudes improve. So this seems to be already the link into which the logic of the program breaks down. So to review rather than preview results, what we find is basically that first, that on average, the effect of the program is so small on security that on average we do not observe it, but that masks the fact that there's a huge heterogeneity of results. So basically, you do observe an improvement in security situation in provinces that do not border Pakistan. And there's absolutely nothing happens in provinces bordering Pakistan. That's true for security measures. That's true for attitudes towards government. But for economic outcomes, that actually we do observe them all over the place. So it does lead to improvement. So if we want to understand, like, so what we learned there, it looks like what we observe is that this logic of winning hearts and minds does work, but conditional. So if it does work in provinces that do not border Pakistan, which we interpret, then it's a matter of interpretation. So our interpretation is based on what we know about the working of insurgency in these areas. And the big difference between the areas that close to Pakistan is that they recruit insurgents mainly not from the local population, but from refugee camps across the border in Pakistan. So our impression, what we see is that in other provinces, you come, you bring aid, the life of people improves. That's why they are not joining themselves in insurgency. You see a reduction in violence. In these areas near Pakistan, you bring aid, the economic welfare improves, but it's not them who are fighting anyway. So it doesn't affect the violence. If anything, we observe that they are become targets of attack, probably because of the same logic that was found in Philippines, that insurgents don't want them to get this aid. So they're attacked, that as a result, they do not improve their attitudes towards government, and doesn't have any effect on insurgency and level of violence, because that's not the local population that is fighting there. So basically, the conclusion that our interpretation of the results is that you have to be very careful if you come up with this idea that this development aid will lead to an improved insecurity situation. You have to be aware of the context in which you're working. So if it's a context in which you want to prevent the people who are getting aid from joining insurgency, yes, that might work. They will get aid, their life will improve, they will not join insurgency, violence will go down. If it's in an area in which they are being attacked by insurgents, you should find other ways of reducing violence. That will not change the level of violence. This approach will not work. And another important point that we think is crucial, comparing our results with the results in Philippines, for example, that why we don't observe the increase in violence in places not bordering Pakistan is that in Afghanistan, it was very decisive program. So if they tell you that this village is getting aid, it will get aid anyway. Even if they try to attack, they make sure that this village will get it anyway. So there's no point by insurgents to attack it to prevent aid from coming, which was very different from the case, my understanding. The case in the Philippines, in which by attacking villages, you can prevent aid from coming. So this indecisiveness in Philippines could be the thing that leads to these negative effects of aid, and this is because of this very determined way of delivering aid in Afghanistan. It was leading to positive effects in provinces, at least in provinces not bordering Pakistan. So, but the overall conclusion is that there is some hope that this approach of winning hearts and minds by bringing development aid is working in terms of reduction of violence, at least in some areas, in the areas in which insurgency is based on the recruitment of local population. Thanks a lot.
All right, our third speaker is Jacob Shapiro. Jake's an associate professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton, and the co-founder and co-director, along with Joe Felter, whom we heard from earlier today, of the Empirical Studies of Conflict project, where they've been doing important work working on data availability for people to study conflict, and also encouraging discussion of data-driven research on conflict. Jake's an expert on the organization of terrorist groups, on the relationship between economic development and conflict, and on counterinsurgency. He wrote a terrific book about how terrorist organizations work and why they're like your local bureaucracy. And he's going to talk to us about some of that today. He's also done work in an amazing number of conflict countries, including Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, India, Colombia, and the list goes on. So look forward to hearing from Jake.
Thanks, Ethan. Thank you. So thank you, Ethan and Daniel, for the chance to speak with this awesome group, and obviously thank you to the Pearson family for your foresight and generosity. You've basically supported something that Joe and I have been working to build for the last 8 years, and that's awesome to see. What I want to do is, Melissa and Ruben showed you a set of work that was kind of fantastic at picking out very particular causal effects, and I want to do something very different. And what I want to do is show you, using terrorists' own internal correspondence, a bunch of facts about how they are organized that lead to some interesting conclusions about the managerial challenges they face, and therefore the policy problem that they pose. And the way I want to do this, again, is using documents that were captured by the US government in the course of operations in various countries going back to 1998. And this is possible in large part because of work that Joe did when he was running the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point to set a precedent for getting these materials out from US government archives and into the public record. So I'm going to try and show you like lots of entertaining snippets and give you a way to think about it. And so I want to start with 3 facts about how terrorist groups are organized, and I'll show you these with documents from Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda in Iraq, but these are things that seem to be pervasive across terrorist groups. Okay, and so the first fact is there's lots of strife and discontent within terrorist groups. And so this is from a letter that Ayman al-Zawahiri, there on the upper left, wrote to a cell in Yemen in 1999. And we know this because after the US invasion of Afghanistan, Zawahiri's laptop ended up in the hands of a Wall Street Journal reporter and was then kind of taken by 2 big burly guys, Mike and John, who showed up that night to take it away from him. In this letter, Zawahiri kind of writes to this cell in Yemen and basically castigates them on 11 points in which their expenses are kind of unacceptable. Right? This is the first. He goes on to say things like, you bought a new fax machine when you have a perfectly good used one, you put someone up in a guest house when you had space at your house, and this is kind of unacceptable. And they write back and basically say, look, we don't appreciate being micromanaged, and so we quit. All right? So it's maybe not what we would think of terrorist masterminds doing. This is not really unique. So the gentleman on the upper left there is Abu Hafs al-Masri. He was often referred to as al-Qaeda's military commander. And on the right is Abu Kebab. And Kebab was running training camps in Afghanistan in the late 1990s that were kind of competing a little bit with Hafsa's camps, and they both fell under the al-Qaeda mantle around mid-1998. In 1999, they get in an extended spat, and the letters are there because when US forces went to Haf's house after dropping a bomb on it during the invasion, they found a box with 275 CDs in it that was his work correspondence back to 1993. And so in that box is this series of letters where Hafs and Kebab go back and forth on things like this, right? So Hafs here accuses Kebab of not returning his travel advance, basically. Kebab writes back to Hafs and says, yes, but you sent 2 people to my training camp last month, and they didn't have the proper documentation, and that's a security risk. Hafs then writes back and says, yes, but you bought some air conditioners for tents in your camp, and no one else has air conditioners. And they kind of go on like this for a while, right? So this is not maybe the kind of thing you would expect to see within these groups. And it's not just kind of spending, right? You see this over tactics as well. So this is from a letter that was written by the Leadership Council of al-Qaeda in Iraq, then led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi on the upper left there, to a cell in Yemen. And this is a letter that's sent right after they assassinate, in a very graphic and public way, Sheikh Nasser al-Fadawi, which is one of the events, he was a prominent guy, and this is one of the events that's credited often with turning the Sunni population in Anbar against al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2006. This was kind of the start of it. And in this letter, this is an excerpt, but they write to Abu Usama, and they basically say, look, we agree with you about the people you're targeting. You're killing the right people, but you're doing it in the wrong way, right? You're doing it in this public way that's going to turn them against you. It's violating all kinds of community norms. So please just take them out into the desert and shoot them quietly. Abu Usama writes back, and we have his response, because these letters were found on a USB drive that was being carried by a courier between the 2 groups, who was stopped at a checkpoint. And so Abu Usama writes back and basically says, look, you senior middle managers, you senior managers, you guys seem to get killed a lot. And every time you get killed, I get new rules for how I'm supposed to do my job. So can we please get some like standard operating procedures so that I can like do things in a consistent way over time, right? So this is the kind of correspondence that for anyone who's ever been part of a large organization looks like really familiar, but it's a little bit strange to see this inside a terrorist group. So that's the first fact we want to explain, right, is there's lots of strife and discontent. The second fact is that lots of stuff gets written down that poses some operational risks. And so I want to show you a few examples of this. So this document, this is from a cache of about 700 pledges for various things that were signed by people going to fight for al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2007 that were found in the border town of Sinjar on the Iraqi-Syrian border, an area now controlled by Daesh. And in this particular pledge, this gentleman is coming into Iraq to be a suicide bomber, and he's asked to attest to a number of things, like he'll pay attention to the orders of his bosses, and he's stating that he's there of his own volition. And this is a reasonable thing for someone to attest to, and they've nicely kept his picture and his thumbprint. This is another thing that was found in that same cache. This is a pledge of someone leaving Iraq. So this person had come in as a fighter, he'd done his time on the front lines, and now he wanted to go home. And before he goes home, the group has him sign this document that says things like, I'm leaving voluntarily, I won't come back to Iraq without permission, I won't affiliate with other terrorist groups. And they very nicely kept not just his picture, but his real name, his alias when he was in Iraq, his phone number in case they need to reach him, and a fingerprint. And so what's a little bit strange about this is not that you would keep this or want your people to attest to this, right? Some of the things here about like obeying your superiors, I'd like my graduate students to agree to. The weird thing is you would keep, if you're a covert army, more than 700 of these in an oil drum buried in the desert where the forces who are trying to find and kill you can find them, and did find them, and that's why we have it today. And it wasn't just kind of these individual documents. This stuff got rolled up in ways that were also counterproductive. Not counterproductive, risky. So this is from a personnel tracking spreadsheet produced by al-Qaeda in Iraq's successor organization, the Islamic State of Iraq. And we think this was produced in Diyala province in mid-2007. And so let me show you this translated in English. So this is a document where the administrative emir at the time records for 400 fighters their full name, where they're from, their alias, right, their kunya, the name they're fighting under, when they joined the group, their address, and then a bunch of other information like what skills do they have, where are they saying, Do they have injuries that are relevant for where you would use them? And so if you're thinking about rational human resources management, this is a great thing to have, right? But if you're thinking about staying covert and avoiding detection by your enemy, maybe this is kind of problematic. And so you want to think about what's going on inside the organization that would motivate them, despite the cost, to keep materials like this. OK, so that's the second fact. Lots of stuff that's operationally risky gets written down. The third fact is that there's a great deal of attention to keeping financial records. And let me show you some examples of that. So this is a report on reimbursements that was produced by the provincial administrative emir for Diyala province in early 2007. And you'll notice, if you look on the right there in the original, that this is like a standard form that's printed up multiple times and he's filled out by hand. And it looks like these went in about every 2 weeks. And what he's doing is he's just listing the names of the people he gave money to, right? And he's listing reimbursements like this because they had a formal process. In the group at the time, to get reimbursed for things, you needed to produce a document like this. So this is a reimbursement chit for medical care from the same group in the same period. And this was submitted by someone who had been injured and then wanted some money for their hospital treatment. And what I want to draw your attention to here is these signature blocks. There are 4 of them. And so it turns out that the rules of the group at the time said if you want to get reimbursed for medical care or for other expenses, you needed the signature of your unit leader, your unit financial administrator, your provincial leader, and your provincial financial administrator. So you had to go around and get this thing signed by 4 different people in order to get reimbursed for expenses incurred in fighting the jihad. Now, this, again, if you're worried about like managing the money, this is a great thing to do. But think about the interpersonal interactions you're requiring here in an environment where you're being surveilled and watched, and people are targeting you based on who you interact with, right? That's strange. And the reason this was done is the group took a lot of care to kind of track stuff in rational organizational ways. So this is from the administrative emir of the group overall in fall of 2007, reporting his monthly revenues for the last 7 months of 2005, right? And you know, he's kind of reporting monthly revenues here in Iraqi dinars. Over time, the chart chunk changes, but the basic format remains the same, right? So this is spring 2006. This is the same person. He's decided he likes 3D. This administrative emir is removed, and the next person later that year didn't like those 3D charts and switches to something different, right? And so this is through September 2006. So the reason I show these is like they're kind of funny and stuff, but I think the point underlying these is we have to think about why you need this kind of stuff, right? You're running an organization which for periods of the Iraq War had 40 to 50% annual mortality, right? And we know this because we have personnel records, which I'll show you a little later. So you have incredibly committed fighters doing a very dangerous job, and you need to, for some reason, keep this stuff. And the basic problem is that you have to delegate, right? The leaders in the organization have a vision for how they want things done and how they want money spent, but they need to hire a bunch of people to do it. And the people they want to hire to do it have to be willing to do all the horrible and awful things you need to do if you're a committed terrorist fighting in Iraq at the time, right? And they tend not to be maybe the most kind of well-mannered, rules-oriented people, right? So you have these agents that can take actions that can hurt you. And in every other kind of human organization, the solution to these kinds of agency problems is paperwork, right? We have people fill out reports on what they're doing so we can check up on them. And that's what the group was doing here. And so to kind of make this real, I want to show you what Osama bin Laden had to say about agency problems within the global jihadi movement as he's whiling away his time in Abbottabad in 2010. So this is an excerpt from a letter that Osama bin Laden wrote in 2010 to this man who was briefly the second in command of the group. And this is a letter about the doctrine of Tadarus, which is kind of a doctrine, which I'm sure I mispronounced, that's basically about when is it permissible to kill your fellow Muslims in the pursuit of attacks against non-Muslims, right? And bin Laden basically in this letter says, look, you, all my agents out there in the global jihad pursuing the fight against the West and against the apostate Arab leaders, you are overstepping the boundaries of what's acceptable. You're basically doing violence in ways that's counterproductive to our political cause. And so when you do things like attack people in mosques on holy days, right? Or target them where there are lots of worshipers present, you're going to turn the people who should be supporting us against us. And so you need to rein in your use of violence. And this is exactly the problem, or the kind of problem, that I'd posit is being solved with all this paperwork. Okay, so that's a neat story, and it's a really rational story, right? It's about a group that's kind of implementing bureaucratic procedures because they're trying to figure out how to solve managerial problems. And, you know, it's kind of tempting to say, well, what we're doing is we're just putting like a really Western face on this, and this is too rational. So I want to show you some evidence that maybe that's not true. So this is an excerpt from the trial testimony that Jamal Ahmed al-Fadl gave during the trial in 2000 for the 1998 Africa embassy bombings. So al-Fadl, pictured in the courtroom picture there on the upper right, was the star witness for the prosecution at the trial. And he had been part of the Nairobi cell, got caught stealing money from the group, went on the run, and after the bombings approached the US government and said, hey, I hear you have this thing called the Witness Protection Program. I might have some information for you. And so on direct examination, the prosecutor is trying to get out anything from al-Fadl that would impugn his testimony, including times he might have had disputes with the group. And so this is al-Fadl reporting the time that he went to bin Laden and asked for a raise and was told no. And I had this conversation 2 years ago with my chair. I went to my chair and I said, I think I need to be paid more and I need some more research money. And my chair said, well, go get an outside offer and show me your value on the market is higher than I think it is, and I'll match your value on the outside market. And in this quote, right, what bin Laden is saying to his guy is, I have people who work for me who can go home and earn a good living, and I have to pay them at least as much as they could earn at home to keep them working for me. You, on the other hand, have no outside offer, and so I don't have to increase your salary, right? So this is exactly kind of rational human resources management, right? This is kind of what we teach in B schools as far as how you pay people. So last thing I want to talk about is direct evidence of graft and corruption within the group, right? And I want to show you kind of the closest thing we have to direct evidence for al-Qaeda in Iraq and the Islamic State of Iraq that there's kind of rampant, that there's significant theft going on within the group. But to do that, I have to tell you a little bit about how they got paid, okay? So how do we know how they got paid? Well, because we have things like this. So these are screenshots of income and expense spreadsheets that al-Qaeda in Iraq's administrative emir in Mosul kept in August 2007. And the way these sheets, let me show you this in English. So the way these sheets are laid out is basically the administrative emir has a tab for each unit working for him. And the people in each unit would send up a report each month saying, here are the people who work for me, right? And he had this thing all nicely hyperlinked so that what would happen is from each of these tabs where you have a different unit, right, it would roll up into this total workers tab. And under the orange banner, you had about, at this point in time, 1,200 people who are active fighters who are getting payments every month. And then way down here under a green banner are about 500 martyrs whose families are still getting payments. And you record some useful information, right? You've got a unique ID number for each person, because this person had a challenge telling one Abu Mustafa from the other, just like we do, in looking at these. And then he records the marital status and number of children, how much they're getting in terms of reimbursements for expenses incurred on behalf of the group, and then what their salary is, right? And the reason he's recording the number of kind of dependents in the household isn't that he wants to, you know, send cards on kids' birthdays or anything like that. It's because that's the way the salary was set up, right? So this is a translation of the group's salary rules for 2005 and 6, and there are similar ones in later periods. And for those of you in the back who might not be able to read this, basically what it says is your base salary as a fighter is 60,000 Iraqi dinars a month. And then for each dependent you have, you get an increment of about 30,000 Iraqi dinars, right? So he's recording this because the way he figured out how much money he had to send out to each of his units so they could make payroll every month was based on the number of dependents each fighter had, okay? And so there are two things I want to highlight about this. The first is the average person, given kind of the number of dependents they had, fighting in al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2006 and 7, made between 120,000 and 150,000 Iraqi dinars a month. That's about 60% of what the median illiterate unemployed person could cobble together in a monthly basis in Iraq at that time. So these guys were fighting for completely awful wages. right? They were not, there was no sense in which the group was competing in the labor market for these people. The second thing is they had this rule, which is listed down here, for the families of martyrs and detainees. And it basically says that if you're martyred, if you die fighting for the group or you're detained, we're going to continue making payments to your family. And that's going to turn out to be really important for how graft plays out in the group. Okay, so let's step forward. So this is going to be really hard to read. I apologize for that, but I'll walk you through it. This is an Excel spreadsheet on expenses for Mosul in December 2007. So same administrative emir. And what he's done is on the left, he's listed all kind of his expenses. And then he's made some notations in other parts of the chart. And there's this stuff here on the right that I want to draw your attention to. And I'll tell you what that says in a minute. We can zoom a little bit. And for those of you who can read it, he says, Abu Nasir had these names, and then lists 12 people. He deleted them. We don't know if they were real or illusory. So Abu Nasir is one of the cell leaders here. And so we showed this translation to a former Iraqi general who's now at the RAND Corporation, who was working on some of this stuff with us. And he said, oh, that's a terrible translation. What he's saying is Abu Nasir had ghost employees, and that's a problem. And so what was basically happening is Abu Nasir was padding his payroll with people who weren't actually on it, or at least that's what it reads as. And if you think about kind of the dynamics here, that kind of makes sense as a method for graft, right? Remember, the money goes from the central treasury out to the unit leaders on the basis of their employees. And so if you're out there working hard and face a 50% annual mortality rate, and you feel like you're not that well compensated by the group, one thing you could do is pad the payroll a little bit. So now how do you do that to minimize the chance you get caught? So let me show you some statistical evidence that administrative emir's successor, Abu Zaid, put together. So Abu Zaid was the successor in Mosul as the administrative emir to the previous person I showed you. And he has a new format for his roll-up. So this is at the end of a long Excel spreadsheet where he lists all the different units that are fighting for him. And on this page, I'll show you in English, what he's done is he's listed for each of his units, so for the administrative battalion or the financing company or the media battalion of Sheikh Abu Masriya Al-Ghraib, it's got others, the vehicle-borne improvised explosive device rigging battalion. For each of these, he's listed the number of fighters and then the number of dependents. And then at the bottom, he's calculated some statistics on the number of dependents that his active fighters have and the number that his deceased fighters have, right? And what Abu Zaid learns here is, if you do the math, is the deceased fighters have about 30% more dependents on average than the active fighters. So unless you think something about raising a family makes you want to martyr yourself, which, depending how old your kids are, maybe it does. But what this looks like to us is evidence of graft, right? Think about the process of detecting fraud if you're padding the payroll by claiming increased dependence for your fighters, right? If I claim increased dependence for Abu Mustafa, who's an active fighter, the administrative emir can reach out and say, hey, you know, number 1236, how many kids do you have, right? And he gets an answer, and either that matches what's in my payroll documents or not. But if I put up extra dependents for my deceased fighters, right, he actually has to go to the home of the martyr Abu Mustafa and ask to count the children, which is like a socially much more dubious thing and difficult thing to do. So if I'm an administrative emir in this group and I want to pad my payroll, I'm not going to do it by creating like fake fighters. I'm going to do it by padding the payroll for deceased fighters' families. Okay, so what are the implications of all of this? The big implication here is that any group that wants to grow to a significant size and utilize the skills and energies of a diverse group of fighters is going to need a lot of paperwork and a lot of bureaucracy to manage them, right? To keep them all pointing in one direction so that they advance the political goal and don't set it back. But all that paperwork and bureaucracy creates information that the people trying to stop you can use against you, right? They can use it to trace out the links between your fighters, they can use it to figure out what you're doing, and they can use it to kind of degrade and damage your organization. And so what this means is that as long as government counterterrorism efforts are aggressive and directed at these groups, they face this endogenous size constraint, right? There's a growth point beyond which they can't grow because as they get bigger, they give off more information, which makes it easier to fight them, and that caps their growth. And so all these managerial problems lead to kind of a self-limiting characteristic that this type of organization has.
All right, great. Thank you guys for 3 super interesting and stimulating talks. So we're going to take a little time, I think, to, I have a couple questions for you that I'll hold off for a second and see if you guys have questions that for one another. Put 4 academics on the stage, and they're going to have something to say about each other's research. So I'm going to give you guys the opportunity to ask each other questions if you have any.
So I had one question actually for Melissa, which is, I'm a little curious if the equilibrium has started to be reestablished in some areas, right? If I look at the reporting, it looks like the violence in Mexico has started to come down a bit from the point where it was. And just to reiterate something Melissa said, in 2010, the worst place in Afghanistan, like the very most violent place at the peak year of the war in Afghanistan, would have been the 9th most violent city in Mexico. Right? So the scale of the violence was really remarkable. So I'm curious, is there anything you're seeing in how that's come down and where it's come down?
Yeah, so I think you see it coming down, but very slowly. So the general pattern, with very few exceptions, is that violence can increase very suddenly, but it tends to decline only at a very slow rate. So once you've sort of disrupted that equilibrium, eventually it may get worked out, but it takes quite a long time.
I want to flag something, I guess, maybe for the audience that comes out of both Melissa and Ruben's talk. So both of them spent a fair bit of time in their talks before they told you about their findings, telling you about how they were going to get their findings. Right? They spent a lot of time on that, and not just because they're professors, although that's what professors do. So working on these kinds of questions, right, answering these kinds of questions in these kinds of environments, really, really hard problem. And both of them in different ways were showing you ways in which they're so hard. So you're in these environments. In Ruben's case, he actually managed through heroic efforts to do a randomized trial. You're in these environments, however, where most of the time that's impossible. Melissa talked about this. And where everything's related to everything else, right? We think that the politics is responsive to the violence, and the violence is responsive to the politics, and the economics are responsive to the violence and the politics, which are responsive. Everything's mixed up together, right? That's what we mean when we talk about an equilibrium. Everything's mixed up together, and it's very, very hard to tease apart what causes what in that kind of environment. You got to think really hard about how to set up comparisons, how to set up control groups in the language that Melissa used, right, to make a credible claim that you've learned something causal, which is often what we want to do when we want to talk about a policy intervention, because we want to answer a causal question of the form, if I did this thing, how would things change? Right? If I did some intervention, if I change counter-narcotics policy, would violence go up or down? That's what I want to know. For that, I got to know the causal relationship between that counter-narcotics policy and the violence. I don't want to just know the correlation. And so they both sort of jumped through a lot of hoops and did heroic work to try and make a credible claim along those lines. Okay? So that's great, and that's what's so great about these papers. So I want to push on that a little bit by pointing out each of you then, right, once you did that, then said, now it turns out there's a lot of heterogeneity, right? So in places, one of Melissa's results is in places where the pen was before, or places where you have an interior territory or an exterior territory, these things, right? It turns out the effect of the change in counter-narcotics policy is different there, the estimated effect. In Ruben's case, right, we had different effects of his randomized trial in places that were far from or close to Pakistan, right? And those heterogeneous effects are the kind of deep and nuanced thing that we're trying to get to at the research. At the same time, it's a methodological problem for us, right? Because you guys did all this work to come up with really smart ways to say, I've estimated a causal effect. I got something that changed either because I forced it to change through my computer or because the election was just right and it was random and now it's causal. But now those things that are giving you the heterogeneity, those weren't, you didn't get to nobody let you randomize whether a city was close to Pakistan. It just is, and that thing might be associated with also. So I just want to throw out for you, and that's a sort of a common thing that comes up in this kind of work that we have to deal with. So I want to open up to you as talking about this sort of challenge of the heterogeneous effects and what that does to how we think about causal effects.
Yeah, so I think the biggest problem, right, is when you don't have an overall effect and you start looking at a bunch of different subgroups and then you find an effect only on one subgroup, but you don't really have an a priori reason for that, and then we start to worry, is this effect real? Is it just by statistical chance? Whereas I think in this like sort of, let's say in the context of my study, it suggests something interesting for future research, right? I already jumped through a bunch of hoops to find this one source of variation. Maybe you're right that some things you can just never find variation in, and we just have to do with the evidence we have. But I think that when you look at these patterns, it also suggests what people might want to study in more detail in the future. You can only do so much in one paper, but it opens up a lot of interesting questions for future research.
Yeah, I agree. Like that two different questions. So one is methodological, whether like when we show heterogeneity results, whether you should believe them, because as Melissa said, like it can be a lot of data mining involved, and there are two ways to approach this. One is becomes a lot popular that you basically pre-commit yourself before looking at the data. You say this will be heterogeneity that I will be looking at, and then it kind of relieves you from the concerns that you were playing with the data just to find something significant. And the second thing that you can do is replication. Like if you find something, just try to find it in other contexts. If it's still there, means that the effect is there. So this is a methodological concern to understand whether the effect is actually there or not. The second, which I think that Ethan had in mind, is like how do you interpret it? Because like when we do randomization, like it's clear that it's either you get the program or not. In our context, we know that the only thing that was different is the program, so if we compare the averages, it's because of the program. With heterogeneity, it becomes an issue of interpreting because, for example, in our case, we know that the program worked in areas that are not bordering Pakistan, that didn't work in areas that are bordering Pakistan. Whether it is really the fact that they're bordering Pakistan that is important, or some other characteristic of these places that happen to be different between those that are close to Pakistan or not, is matter of interpretation. And then you're back to kind of standard empirical issues. So you see the difference, what is driving the difference, and then all the fancy methods of experimental economics are mute here. They don't help you. You have to use your reason, theory that you have to additional empirical evidence to argue and to persuade the reader, the readers of your listeners of your paper, it's actually your story is correct, but you will never able to be like fully sure until you either do some replication, which you really isolate this effect, or something else that is fancy and tricky to get at the causal evidence of this the second factor that you observe in heterogeneity. But this is another important issue that's why I've tried, for example, when I was saying, like, it seems to us that the reasonable explanation is that they recruit people here and not there. But we cannot prove. We are sure that the fact is here we see it, here we don't, and then it's our speculation to interpret why we see it here, why we don't. This is our interpretation. Maybe it's wrong. Maybe there's different interpretation. We try to argue our case, but this is only as much as we can do it.
So I think, Ethan, I would like reframe what you said not as a problem or a challenge, but as an opportunity, right? In the sense that often in evaluating these programs or interventions, we're really interested in understanding not just like, does it work or not, but where is it likely to work? Because ultimately resources are constrained and policies can only be implemented in so many places, right? And so I think the thing to say for the students and future policymakers is, when you're going in and thinking about a program, and in the course of debates about the program, you have arguments about where it's going to work or where it's not going to work, you can roll out in ways that let you sort that out and then retarget to the places where you're having the biggest kind of effects. And so the heterogeneity it's kind of like maybe a bit of a pain for us in terms of thinking about testing big theories, but it's an opportunity for learning from the policy perspective.
Yeah, I only agree. It's just like as economists, what we teach to our students, that the economists always have one answer to almost any question. It depends. and this heterogeneity result, they just prove the same thing. It really depends whether it works or not. And I agree with Jake that it's really a big opportunity to understand where it works, where it not. It's not only for practical reasons, but also for big theoretical reasons, because if when you have a theory in mind, why it works here, why it not, you can test it using this heterogeneity results.
So Jake, I want to ask you a question about a policy application of your work. So So on your story, all else equal, if I'm a counterinsurgent or a counterterrorist, the more bureaucratized my enemy, the better for me. Right? Now, other things may be changing, but if I could, right, the more records they keep, the more likely it is I get to learn stuff about them when I get their thumb drive, and then I know lots of things that are going to help me get them, which I think is an interesting kind of thought. So it raises for me the question of, do you have thoughts about what are the kind of policy levers a counterterrorist or a counterinsurgent might think about pulling to get their enemy, holding everything else equal, right, to get their enemy to have to engage in more of this kind of behavior, to make the, right, in lots of contexts you're concerned with information flows. And here it seems like an opportunity for the counterterrorist or the counterinsurgent to get not the population whose hearts and minds you're trying to win, but the actual enemy to reveal their information slowly over time once you recover the stuff. And so I wonder if you have both evidence on what leads these groups to become more or less bureaucratized, what kind of factors, and whether there's sort of policy lessons there to think about. We can force these guys to reveal more of their information.
So I think on the evidence, the big thing that you see when you kind of look across groups historically is events where there is some attack that kind of goes way beyond what the population will tolerate, and kind of for accidental reasons, like the group just screws up in terms of issuing an announcement, or the explosion is much bigger than they expected, and they get a big negative response from the population. And on a number of occasions historically, that kind of thing has led groups to kind of ramp up the oversight of operational units and therefore create these kinds of vulnerabilities. So you can think about creating that by doing things like not consistently being very aggressive about publicizing the awful things that result from attacks, but by doing so in like a more stochastic fashion, right? The other thing you can think about doing is create the appearance of graft and fraud when it doesn't exist, right? And I've had a number of people articulate to me that that was done to effect in Iraq with respect to this group. There are historical precedents for that, particularly from the Philippines, where there was kind of an information campaign done against the New People's Army that basically triggered a sense within the group that lots of people couldn't be trusted, which led to people using, as a way to gain power within the group, accusations at others, which kicked off kind of a spiral of retribution within the group. So there are these examples where governments have kind of reached in and like tweaked the perception of the kind of agency problems to great effect. Presumably, how vulnerable a group is going to be to that depends a little bit on how they keep their records and how vulnerable they are to things like electronic intrusions.
What about leadership turnover? So if I think about the drone program, do I think that the drone program has forced them to become more bureaucratized by increasing leadership turnover?
So that's a good question, and I don't really know the answer. I mean, I think the sense that I think you get is that there's some pressure from people lower down to get SOPs written if you do that. And there's some work that I've done, some theoretical work, which would suggest that basically there's great value for groups in terms of managing these kinds of problems in very difficult operating environments if you have some sense of organizational history. Right? And the intuition you should have is if Ruben's working for me and we're in a very hard environment where he's going to fail more often than not, I want to be able to use rules to discipline him that take into account his performance over a long period of time. Right? Because if I only take into account a short period of time, I'm just going to see him screw up a lot and so fire him, and he might actually be like working really hard. And so harder environments, you need institutional memory. That can reside either in the mind of someone who's been with the group for a long time or in written records. And so if you think about groups where, for theoretical reasons, there'd be value in that long history, and you start knocking off their leadership, then you're going to be creating strong incentives for kind of paper or electronic record keeping.
So now that you guys have gotten talking, though, I'm going to invite you one more time where we can open it up to the audience. Yeah. All right, so I think we have some mics, so if you'll raise your hand, I think somebody will come to you with a mic. We have a couple up front here.
I'm not hiding, but I thought I'd stand only because I am Tom Pearson. I do have a couple of, well, I don't mention that. I enjoyed the presentation, Ethan, and would pose this question to you as well as the three panelists. And understand I'm asking in the context of the Institute's objective, which is the study and resolution of global conflicts. The question is two-part. First, with regards to the type of research that you do, what level of peer review or other critical review is done both during and after the time that your work is published? And then more importantly, once it's published, how's that work communicated to those that will basically employ it and use it, in our case, hopefully for the study and resolution of global conflicts? So with that, I'll sit down.
So I can speak to the second point about communication, because I just had 2 weeks ago an incredibly encouraging experience on this front. So the basic mechanism for communication is twofold. One is we publish these things in journals that are read by people who maybe work for think tanks, and then they take that into account in how they talk to folks in the policy community. So there's kind of that translation. And then there are direct engagements where we're asked to come speak to people in government or at kind of conferences where the think tank community is getting together to think about problems. And for a long time, I was very dubious about the progression of research into that environment because it seems kind of slow and indirect. And so 2 weeks ago, I was invited to a meeting that was put on by the Pearson Institute on links between economic despair and poverty and violent extremism. And when they conceptualized the meeting, they thought they would get everyone together and reach consensus that poverty was a real root cause of violent extremism, and then they would go off and plan some programming around poverty. And for the program, they commissioned a series of 5 papers to summarize different aspects of the research. And basically, all the papers came in citing work by people on this panel and a number of folks that Ethan and Joe and others have been working with for years that said, actually, no, the link's not there. It's not that simple. It's much more complicated. And so in the opening presentation for the meeting, former Secretary Albright gets up to welcome everyone and says, look, and this was literally the first sentence of her remarks, if there's one thing we've learned from research over the last decade, it's that there's no simple link between poverty and violent extremism. And that was like, oh my God, right? That was kind of one of the first times in one of these venues I've been in where a very senior policymaker comes in and says, based on this kind of careful research, we need to rethink how we're approaching this policy problem. And so the more of this kind of research that gets out there, I think the more moments like that there are going to be, and the better the policy discourse is going to become as a result.
Yeah, so I think that's very true, and clearly not every policymaker is receptive to evidence-based policymaking. So you just kind of have to do the work and hope that ultimately it will be received. But for example, in the work I did in obtaining the data, I worked closely with authorities in Mexico. I talked with people in the US Customs and Border Patrol Intelligence Office about what we can learn. The Organization of American States saw the research and asked to write a policy brief about it for heads of states in the Americas. So I think that there's various opportunities out there. Not every policymaker will be receptive, but as long as we keep up those links, you know, all of us travel a lot. We're going to different places, talking to different people. We have colleagues in academia who've worked in policymaking. And so I think that there's a really good network such that policymakers who are interested in these results really do have the opportunity to hear about them, and it's incumbent upon us to communicate them in a way that's clear, that's not too technical, that makes a lot of intuitive sense.
Yes, I agree. There are basically 2 stages of life in each of this research. One is like the peer the early stage is very much subject to peer review when you want to talk mainly with your peers to be sure that what you're finding is actually interpreted in the correct way, for example, which was, for example, in our study was very important because initially I think we were interpreting not fully correct way, and by peer pressure we had to come up with more data and analysis more carefully and to make sure that what we find is actually what is there in the data. And then once you are more or less sure of your findings, then you go to the real world. And I think the most important, I agree, is actually talking with people. So yes, we publish it, You can publish it in a more accessible way. We try to do it just that without all the technical details of what we've done, just like the gist of it. But actually, there's nothing that substitutes, like talking to people is much more effective.
Yeah, and I'd like to chip in as well that I think it's not just that you do the research and you talk to people after, but for example, my paper, I was first approached by policymakers in Mexico, and what they said is, you know, we're dealing with really big challenges here, and every day it's a crisis. Every day we're putting out a fire, and we just want to sit down and think about this and spend some serious time thinking about what's going on, what the impacts are that our policies are having, but we don't have time because there's always a fire. And so we thought, you know, we talked to some academics, and they'd seen some other work that I'd done about guerrilla groups in Peru, and they said, you know, you've thought about this before. We'd love you to spend some time thinking about it. Let us help you to get access to the data you need. You know, you decide what question you want to answer, but we're really interested in these issues, and we need somebody who has the time to think about it, which there's a lot of really smart policymakers out there, but it's just always every single day another issue to deal with, and it's really hard for them to sit down and think about things. So I think that having those conversations initially are great as well, so that the research that we're doing is at least in part directed by the sort of problems that policymakers are facing.
I think Melissa's answer also points to this sort of more general, we have, I think, in our heads the idea that the only way or the main way that research makes, or this kind of thinking makes its way to policy is through the policy briefing. That we have a study, it has a finding, you tell a policymaker and they're supposed to act on it. And I think, you know, they've got lots of concerns and lots of other things going on, and that's probably rarely the case, although they're interested sometimes to hear the findings. But this point that there's other kinds of interaction. So one of them is on the front end, why are you doing the study? How do I get the data? I think lots of people who work in this space learn that relationships with policymakers is the only way to get access to the data. Another is through educational interactions. That can be with students who you send out later. It can also be through other kinds of educational interactions. Jake and I will be together in DC next week, not briefing on a research finding, but educating a group of military and intelligence officials who make policy, right? And we're going to be teaching them about this way of thinking. We're going to be teaching them about some of the research findings, but it's going to be a different kind of interaction. But again, they're going to hear the policy messages of the research. They're going to hear why the social scientific approach is so important to the way they think about these things. And it's a very different kind of environment than the policy brief, but it's at least as important, and I think probably more important of a way that this stuff soaks in to the way policy gets thought about and made. I'll just say one word, since nobody has, about peer review. This kind of stuff is all peer-reviewed left and right. So it's peer-reviewed at the beginning because this work is expensive to do, and the funding agencies do very rigorous peer review because they've got precious resources and they want to make sure they're giving it to good people with good ideas. And it's peer-reviewed at the end because it's published in academic journals, which are subject to the critique of their colleagues who can be rough on them. So.
Hi, my name is Nicole Anderson, and I'm with a fellowship program within Harris called the International Innovation Corps. And we have fellows in India right now who are sort of straddling research that's going on at University of Chicago and elsewhere, and the governments in India. And a lot of what I see them finding is the difference between what the government can do and what research says we should do. And particularly, Ruben, for you, I'm very curious, in as I understand it, the research that you did was using federal money and the government money. How have you sort of straddled that, what they want to do, and have you run into questions that they don't want the answer to, and how do you get around that? And that's for everyone.
No, we haven't run into the problem of them wanting to do something and not being able, because but that was specific to our case, because it was already a working program, and we were like called by these agencies to tell them how, like, to assess and to tell them how it's actually working, whether there are some ways to improving it. So it was already a working program. But this is a serious issue in many other contexts that we're tried, like, including the failed evaluations that we've started because of this. Because you want this government, they want to do some policy, they ask you to help them to evaluate how it works, and then it collapses completely because they cannot implement this policy. And that's the main outcome of your impact evaluations, that it failed. It cannot be published in any academic journal, but you learn a lot from these experiences. So this is definitely a serious issue, which I'm afraid is not that much reflected in academic research, because it ends up to non-published works. But this is also important why it's important to talk with people. People talk about these programs a lot, attempts to do something, the failed attempts. But these failed attempts, they never make it to published policy briefs, research, etc.
So if I can, let me just use the example of India and infrastructure development in Naxalite-affected areas as an example of, I think, where this kind of research can actually show you things that people got wrong before. So we've recently, with a colleague at Paris School of Economics, completed basically a 2-year project of going around to all 8 Naxal-affected states and going to the offices that run each of the big 5 infrastructure development programs in India to get from the state level officials kind of village level information on projects that have been rolled out. And there was this sense among officials in these areas that the Naxalite conflict was seriously hindering their ability to roll out infrastructure. And that was like a common refrain. And so when we took the data on where they'd rolled out infrastructure and the data on where conflict was happening, we found basically no evidence of that. Right? There's very little correlation between the intensity of Maoist violence and the ability to complete infrastructure projects. The only place where there's a consistent relationship is that road projects take a little bit longer to complete and are a little bit more expensive in the high violence villages. Right? But so this thing that everyone believed about how policy was being distorted by conflict isn't supported by the data. And maybe we're missing something in their endogeneity concerns and all that, but like just the face validity of that thing that people thought they were seeing turns out not to be there when you pull all the information together and look at it systematically.
What is similar about terrorism and cancer is that there are a lot of cancers, very different ones, that are treated very differently, that and that have to be treated separate. But there are some common things in it. So with terrorism, I think it's more or less the same. There are a lot of you cannot fight terrorism as a general. Like there are a lot of different terrorisms, and you have to understand the context, which brings back to this heterogeneity of results, etc. It's a strange question whether fight the terrorism. There are a lot of them. That's why you have to accumulate a lot of knowledge to understand how to deal with different types of terrorism.
Yeah, I think this is also very applicable to the war on drugs because like some types of cancer, some types of addiction have a biological basis, right? And it's actually very difficult to do research on that. So take marijuana. It's a class 1 controlled substance in the United States, which means you can't do research using it. Like you actually can with cocaine because it's class 2. And so I think if we took just sort of some of the over $1 trillion spent on the war on drugs since 1970 and invested in thinking about there was a paper in Science recently showing that people's bodies naturally make cannabinoids. If you make fewer of them, you're more likely to use marijuana, like something similar for opiate receptors, right? So certainly this is not going to explain all drug addiction, and there's also a social and a peer basis to it, but I think if we took some of the money that we spend sort of putting people in jail, fighting drug traffickers, and try to treat the supply side that could actually, or try to treat the demand side, that could actually be quite effective.
Let me also point out a thing that I think a deep problem in solutions to policy issues involving human beings, which maybe points a little bit towards some of the work Melissa talked about, which is that human beings, as it turns out, adapt to policy responses. And so Melissa gives us this example of you get a change in counter-narcotics behavior in some city, and you might think, this is going to result in arresting a lot of drug transshipment, but instead the drug transshippers notice the policy change, right, which may have been a good idea, and maybe even a study could have found that it was effective, but they go around the city and they go somewhere else, right? And that's an example, but it's a very general problem of thinking about solutions in this kind of final sense to problems like terrorism, which is that you're thinking about the policy response to the problem today, and the person who you're treating with the policy response is adapting and changing their behavior in response to that, and that's an ongoing and persistent problem, which is just in the nature of dealing with humans.
Hi, thank you for your talk, and my question's to you, Dr. Shapiro. So it's not really a question, more like a request. Could you talk a little bit about ISIS and what we know, because they seem to be like highly organized and they have a way to like recruit people, and so like what do you know about them and how could that help us understand what's going on in the region?
So the question, I think, of what we know about ISIS, I can tell you a few things. One is the US government and Iraqi governments know a ton about how they're organized because they've, on 2 occasions now, picked up the full set of records from the person who's kind of the key record keeper in the group, right? And so there is kind of massive volumes of documentation like what I showed you on the group that's kind of known. And so there's, and in fact, I think I can say this, the barrier to using that more is actually like a labor constraint. Like the volume of the information is so great that given the number of analysts working in the problem, you actually like can't fully exploit it. So that's one thing. The second thing I can tell you with great confidence is very high confidence, is they're not making money off oil, right? So I've been doing some work with the World Bank and NOAA for the last 6 months, using satellite imagery that NOAA collects on different spectral bands to track oil production in areas that Daesh now controls. And basically, if you look at activity measured either in terms of lights on at night in facilities or flaring activity or heat signatures that are indicative of refining, basically all of them start going down in areas that Daesh now controls between 2012 and 2013. They decline faster from 2013 to 2014, and from mid-2014 on, whatever's left falls off a cliff, right? And so so production basically is not happening in significant ways in areas they control. That same decline isn't observed in areas their enemies control, right? And we know from lots of anecdotal evidence that whatever they are producing, they're selling at a 70 to 80% markdown on world market price. Right? So they're selling at massive discounts and not producing much. So whatever their tax base is, it's not resource extraction. So we at least know that from research.
Hey, good afternoon. My name is Dan Kowalski, first-year Harris student. I'm wondering what the new frontier of impact evaluations you think is going to be, whether that's in organizing teams for the evaluations or in the methodologies, whatever it is, particularly in global conflicts and violent extremism.
Well, I don't think I can answer this question because I don't think it's impact evaluation is a methodology. I mean, it's a great methodology. Like, if you can apply it, it's usually the limitation is whether you can actually implement it. There are some methodological advances in these pre-analysis plans, etc., replication of more studies, but people kind of know them. So it's mainly a resource constraint that is limiting the impact evaluation. So it's just it's treated as a method. The frontier is always not in the method, but in the questions that you are asking. And so, like, I cannot answer the question about the frontier and in randomized impact evaluations. An interesting question: what is the frontier in what we should know about the conflicts? But that is different issue. It's substantive, not methodological. And I think that is more relevant. What is substantively what we want to know more, rather than how we can do it. It depends on the context. If you can do it RCT, great, do RCT, that's more. If you cannot, you can find some smart instruments like Melissa does. It's always the driving thing should be the question that you're asking, and then the methodology, you just choose the best one that you can implement in this case.
Can I give a slightly different answer, Ethan? Just really quickly, I think the frontier is actually a shift in production technology towards more of a lab model, because lots of the kind of work that we're all doing requires lots of different skills, and the more you can create kind of professional enduring infrastructure, which is something that the Pearson Institute can do, right? the more time you enable the scholars to spend on the research design and not on some of the details of like munging together the 73 different sources of data that Melissa, for example, used in the Mexico study. I mean, part of what's amazing about that is there are so many different pieces of information that are all put together in the service of evaluating one policy, right? That study took 2 years of Melissa's life, right? And think about if she had a lab supporting her in preparing all that, how many other similar policy evaluations could have been done in that time. And so I would actually say the methodological innovation involves like team production and moving towards more of a lab model. And that's something I think Pearson could be a real leader in.
Yeah, and I think this is absolutely true, and there's just things that you see being studied today that couldn't be studied 20 years ago because the world's so much more globalized. So if I need somebody in Vietnam to help me with the study, it's relatively easy for me to go online or to talk to a colleague there and find someone. So at any given time, I'll have people in Vietnam, China, Japan, Mexico, Colombia, Europe, sort of all over the world who I can easily access and who are helping me with research. And it's great because topics that would have just been completely inaccessible if we were just researchers sitting here in the US, or if you just had researchers sitting in Vietnam or in Mexico, are now things, collaborations that can be done. And that comes partly through the networks you have from, if you're a student here, you have classmates from all over the world. Many people will go back to their home countries, and that'll be a network that you can kind of use for the rest of your life, whether it's in policy and research. And I think that that's really changing the way that things are done.
Yeah, well, if you look at from this side, I completely agree. Especially if you, especially for the institutes like Pearson, it can be combining combining research, networking, and education can have like increase like spillovers on each other, because a lot of networking is from students that go there and help you collect data from all over the world. But if you can concentrate it in one place, that becomes a really important source of input for the researchers to study all different types of questions in global security.
So I have a question for Melissa's work. Kind of a couple of pieces to that, but I'd love to get your view on that. So the first thing is, you looked really at the consequences for violence on that. Is there any evidence for what it did with respect to the flow of drugs, in terms of like whether it disrupted that, price of drugs? So that's the first question. The second question is, you mentioned at the end that these solutions, or finding a solution that is very complicated, and it's clear, I think, from your talk why. Do you have a sense for kind of how we should think about this systematically from a policy point of view, kind of based on your evidence? Because you have these adaptive responses from the drug gangs, and then how do you kind of suggest some kind of game theoretic analysis of that? And the last thing, you can pick any one of the three you want to answer. When you worked with the people in Mexico and you showed them your findings, what was their reaction?
Yeah, so I think that, first of all, how did this affect drug prices in the US? That's something that's very difficult for me to say quantitatively, because I need to know how specific drug markets in the US are linked to specific trafficking routes in Mexico. But if you look at the overall evidence, it seems quite unlikely that this led to a substantial decline in drug consumption or a substantial increase in drug prices in the US. So actually, during the period of the crackdown on the drug trade in Mexico, there's a huge spike in Mexican heroin consumption in the US, and that mostly seems to come from a spike in prescription painkillers that came before that. People became addicted to those, and once there's demand, there's a way to meet it. There doesn't seem to have been a substantial decline in sort of meth or marijuana consumption either, or a substantial increase in prices. And if you look at cocaine prices were going up, but that seems to have a little bit more to do with what was happening to producers in Colombia. So I think that overall, there's no smoking gun that suggests that this decreased drug consumption in the US. I mean, I think in terms of what you can do, so in the appendix to the paper, I do talk about like a game theoretic model where the authorities are playing a game with the drug traffickers, and they're anticipating how drug traffickers are going to choose routes, and the drug traffickers are anticipating where the authorities are going to put checkpoints, and then you can solve out for that game, and it gives you sort of an optimal allocation of law enforcement resources, which is important to think about, right? Because when you put roadblocks in different places, they're going to interact with each other. Since a roadblock in one place will change the best route in another place. So you can do that. I mean, people were kind of pushing me, okay, why are you even talking about allocating law enforcement resources when you showed that this didn't work so well? Like, shouldn't there be a broader shift in priorities, but at least conditional on saying, okay, we're gonna crack down. You can use sort of the insights from the study to think about the best way to do that. And then finally, how did people in Mexico respond? I think it's very mixed, right? Depending on sort of on their objectives. So the original people I worked with were very enthusiastic about it, very enthusiastic about incorporating it. But then you get new people in leadership positions who just aren't interested in this kind of information, and then that can have a big impact. So again, I think it comes down to kind of you need the right person in the leadership position to be receptive to it. And that's just, that's something that you don't have control over, but you hope that over a long enough period of doing this type of research, you have the right kind of people in power to be receptive to it.
Okay, this is directed towards Mr. Shapiro then. I have a question because I heard Mr. Pearson in the back here say distinctly that he was emphasizing resolution of global conflicts. And I heard some of the semantics in your presentation. I kind of got stuck on them, like the use of the word Daesh without, I don't know, it's heavily loaded instead of just saying Islamic State. Doesn't seem too objective. You repeatedly said that you found it strange that they were employing what seemed to be to you normal human resources policies. And it just doesn't sound to me like that the language of your presentation or otherwise is more lending itself towards resolution of a global conflict as opposed to, maybe I just misinterpreted, showing a distinct Western perspective that shows a lack of understanding, or at least what the government seems to just be saying, which is just one perspective.
So I think it's a great question, and the issue of calling it Daesh or Islamic State is an interesting one. My colleagues and I at the bank made a conscious decision to refer to it as Daesh in our materials because that is the preference of our Iraqi interlocutors who are opposed to the group and the, I think, objectively horrific things that it does. And so I'm very happy using a pejorative term for that organization in response largely to kind of what the folks that we're engaged with in the region prefer to use to refer to it. Right? But in general, your point is very well taken that we don't want to be sitting here pushing resolutions from a particular point of view because that can be problematic for the resolution of conflicts. Right? And that's a real challenge, and it's something we've actually been corresponding with some folks about recently, because sometimes there's this tension between using objective neutral language and using the language that will communicate your points to the policy communities that you want to understand them, right? And so sometimes the studious effort to use like really scholarly language makes it really hard for people to take the message. And so, at least in a lot of the work that Joe and I have done over the years, we're like constantly facing this, where you're exactly right. Like we can use the terms that are loaded up with political meaning, and then it's easy for people to listen to the results, or we can use the studiously neutral terms to say the same thing, and then it's like really hard to communicate. And it's constantly a balance. And so I think for an institute like this that's charged with conflict resolution, I think it's something to be very careful about and very cognizant of. And sometimes that decision calculus is going to lean towards using loaded terms, and I think sometimes it's going to lead to using neutral terms. Our calculus with Daesh versus Islamic State was that the right thing to do was to use the like loaded anti-that organization term.
Hi, I have a question for all three speakers. So my question is about choosing a research problem. So I think that there's a tendency for researchers and practitioners alike to focus on the biggest problems, the most intense ones. But as somebody said in the morning section, by the time a problem shows up in the news, it's way too late. So I'm thinking, to what extent do you think the current researchers are focusing on the preventative side of things, and should they be focusing on the preventative side of things in order to get the most impact out of the limited research money that most organizations have?
You've stumped them.
You've stumped us. I mean, I'll just say, I think the hard thing with research on prevention is the N is really small. So if you're thinking about what you do after conflict is broken out, you can think about achieving marginal improvements in individual areas. So say villages in the context of Ruben's study, or towns in the context of Melissa's study, and say something about what you think the effective policies will be for reducing conflict in these local areas, with the implicit theory being some set of local successes in terms of getting conflict resolved or bringing levels of violence down will make possible a resolution of the deep political thing that's causing the conflict in the first place. With prevention, I think that's much harder because often these things kick off really only once in each country, and then they spread through some process that's really about what you do to keep it tamped down once it's started. And so just as a matter of applying the scientific method, when the N is small, the scientific method loses some of the purchase that it has when the N is large.
Part of the motivation underlying, I think, this kind of social scientific research also is that for a policymaker, maybe each problem looks new, and there's the problem of today, and they want to know how you'd evaluate some intervention, the problem of today. This kind of research, and all of the speakers really emphasize this idea in various ways, is rooted in the idea that there are theoretical mechanisms which link across conflicts and across time and across places. Now, that's not to say there's not lots of heterogeneity and that there's not lots of unique things about each setting and each conflict, but we're sort of operating on the belief that there are some key mechanisms which are common across organizations, which are common across human motivations, which are common across conflicts. And so you may be studying the effect of some particular action in Mexico over the last 10 years, or in Iraq over the last 2 years, or in Vietnam 40 years ago, right? But you're doing it in part because you want to know the answer to what happened there, and in part because you think it's helping you learn about how these things work in general. And so the next conflict's going to come along, and of course it'll be new and different in its own ways, but we think we're learning lessons over the course of building up the science, which is applicable to that next set of questions. And if we didn't think that, we kind of wouldn't be doing this work, right? Because just looking at the thing that happened to work in the one thing, that's not motivating, right? We're trying to learn about, the point of doing science is to learn about general things that port across time and space. I think we have time for one last question.
My name is Jerry Regier, and I want to insert a question from a policymaker's perspective. I've spent many years both at the state level and at the federal level in the policy world. One of the things that takes place as a policymaker is that just when you begin to see a policy start working, and usually, hopefully, based on evidence, then they kick the bums out and the new guys come in. And when the new guys come in, generally we look at the policies of the previous people and say, I don't want to have anything to do with policies that were done previously. My question is, you as researchers, how would you advise the Pearson Institute in terms of communication and relationships so that research could be communicated in such a way that it would not be such a barrier to policymakers?
So I think the way I would think about this is actually that the Institute can be a resource, or at least the scholars at it can be a resource of continuity in some contexts. So I've been doing some work in Colombia for 3.5 years now with USAID, and at this point we've seen the USAID team turn over 3 times. And so the only people who, literally the only people engaged in a $250 million aid effort in conflict-affected places in Colombia, funded by the US taxpayer dollars, who remember why the thing was targeted where it was, are the outside academics who've been following it since the start. And that's like crazy on some level, but it also means that there's a role for us in being a resource for the mission when they look at the program and the new team comes in. And that's kind of a weird dynamic that I think we can end up in when we engage in these long-run projects.
I think another thing, this is a really big problem in Mexico that I've seen play out many times, right? And they have no re-election of the federal government there, so it's an even bigger issue. But if you look at one case where this didn't happen, it was the Progreso Oportunidades program, which paid families to keep their girls in school. And part of that may have been that it was sort of politically successful, but also there's been an enormous number of studies showing positive effects of this. So I think that was useful as well. Instead of, it wasn't so easy to say, oh, this was the program of the old guys and it didn't work, when it's both popular with people, but also you have a large number of academic studies and it's being held up as the example to other countries of what they can do. So I think that that's important as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to second this because the same experience in Afghanistan, that if you do a very well designed quantitative study, but which is like with clear results, it can be communicated to this leadership, to the next leadership, to the next. So it's really easy to, once it's done, to communicate it. So we also experienced that we as like the three of us are probably the only ones that work on this project throughout these 8 years. The leadership of the World Bank that worked there, the ministry of this Afghan ministry, the NGOs, they all have changed. Still, when we bring the report and like what we've done, because it's clear what we have done, the results are clear, it's very easily communicated, and it allows for continuity of this program. So it really helps to achieve this goal.
It's also worth re-emphasizing that part of the mission of the Pearson Institute is training students. So if you think about economic policy, it's true that the policymakers at the very top of economic policy making turn over with elections. But a lot of very, very important policy gets made at the next level of the bureaucracy by professionals. And a lot of those people in economic policy were trained in economics at universities like this one. Right? And part of our mission is to train those people for security and conflict policy who provide that professional level continuity, right, deeply informed by serious science as opposed to by anecdote or whim, right, and to have that cadre of real professionals who know how to think about these things and can interact with the science, but are professionals and provide continuity at the level of policymaking. So we are out of time again. I want to start by thanking the participants in our symposium for really stimulating talks. Thank you all for coming. This has been, for me, I think just a great and fascinating day from the morning till now, made possible by extraordinary gift. And we are excited to continue the work of the Institute and make a difference on this stuff. So thank you all.